Hello, and welcome to our program. This is a special taped episode of Hemispheres. The original recording was done April 7th, 1997. The program aired April 15, 1997. I'm your host for the program, Richard Curtis. You'll be listening to an interview with Professor Angela Davis of the Philosophy Department and Women's Studies departments at San Francisco State University. Angela Davis is best known as a radical activist, a leading voice in philosophy, in radical philosophy for justice. Joining her is Dr. Joy James of the Ethnic Studies department at the University of Colorado at Boulder. Dr. James, a younger scholar, a prodigy of Dr. Davis, is a professor of political science working in ethnic studies. We discussed the future of radical politics in America, seen from the perspective of the late 20th century. And now, Drs. Davis and Joy.
Together or we'll die alone in our world poisoned by exploitation. No sooner taken, they must give and end the vanity of nations. We look one earth on which to live.
Dr. Davis, I was speaking just the other day with a mutual friend of ours, Sender Garland, and he suggested that the most important question I could ask you would be your thoughts for a program of social change given the current capitalist hegemony in the media and in culture generally.
Well, that's an enormous question.
I was going to say.
That's why I thought I'd start with it.
You get the easy one. Go ahead.
And I'm sure it's a question that many people on the left are pondering right now. So I don't know whether I have a global answer, but I do think that particularly at this moment it's extremely important to encourage an anti-capitalist approach in the work that we do, whether it's grassroots work, whether it's work designed to challenge and hopefully to eventually to dismantle institutions like the prison industrial complex. I think this is a period of transition, and I'm very excited to see young people thinking very deeply about what new forms of activism, radical activism, need to be developed. So I guess what I would say is that I'm very open to discussion and exchange. I'm participating, as a matter of fact, in a number of conferences and meetings over the next several months that precisely will explore how to encourage, for example, radical anti-racist strategies that reflect the situation of global capitalism. So I think I would like to leave it at that for the time being, and hopefully during the course of the discussion with Joy James, we will perhaps answer this question in more specific kinds of contexts.
Well, even if, I can come in right now, Angela, I was having dinner the other night with Esteban and Lisa Flores, and I was telling them about the work you're doing in California, both the work around prisons and, as you said, the prison industrial complex, but also the multiracial, multi-ethnic work that you're doing. And we were kind of brainstorming over dinner what it would look like to have not only a critique of capitalism, but also a vision of something that could be called maybe a workers' democracy, that a number of people, and Lisa put this out quite clearly, she works in a clinic with Latinos, Chicanos, particularly women whose whose immigrant status has made them incredibly vulnerable in terms of health care, high risk. But in trying to encourage people to have a critique of capitalism, if there's not a vision of some viable economic alternative, people sort of, in a way, just dig in and want to integrate as much as they possibly can into the present economic system because they don't really believe there's an alternative, particularly with the collapse of the Soviet Union and the problems that Cuba's having. So we were kicking around the idea of groups of people, multiracial groups, it's similar to the work that you're doing in California, Chicanos, African Americans, whites, Native Americans, Asians, coming together and meeting to almost create a theoretical statement or theoretical position on capitalism that could be used by organizing groups that are under so much pressure to just deal with the immediacy of issues around immigrants' rights or human rights violations in prisons.
Dr. James, what are your thoughts about the particular role of culture and the news apparatus in today's culture?
Well, obviously I'm against.
No. What do we do about it?
What do we do about it? Well, what we do about it is what we're doing right now. This is great that this fund drive is going on, and hopefully more people will contribute in this drive that contributed in the past drive, particularly in light of the increasing information about the consolidation of media. I think there was, in fact, on news yesterday on KGNU's news, right? And it offers different forms of news broadcast. But there was a piece on Disney on the internet, marketing to kids, and the way in which, in fact, media has become an outlet for consumerism, basically, for commodifying culture, commodifying people, commodifying even political culture.
What immediately struck me about the question is the difference between now and a century ago. We have a history of radical political action in the world to draw on, and I wonder how much difference does it make that we have this very media-oriented culture today that did not exist 100 years ago?
Well, I think it makes an enormous difference. It makes a difference in a negative sense, and it makes a difference, hopefully, in a constructive sense. I'm remembering experiences not of 100 years ago, but of perhaps 20 years ago, which required us to be very creative about communicating across the nation during efforts to organize, for example, nationwide student strikes. And how difficult it was at that time even to make a long-distance call because the long distance was so expensive. And now, of course, we have the technology with which to be in immediate contact with groups, organizations, and individuals all across the country and indeed all across the globe. So it would seem that that there is a constructive side of the rise of this media-oriented culture and new technological means of communication. We were talking a little while ago about the globalization of capital. And in order to effectively confront a capitalism which now no longer knows national borders and which basically sets up undemocratic governmental structures on its own, we definitely have to think about transnational organizing as well. So I think that we can draw upon some of these new technologies of communication. And perhaps there are ways in which we can draw upon some lessons of the past with respect to developing a critical literacy vis-a-vis the media. I can remember during the late 60s and early 70s, when there were massive uprisings and organizing was going on around political prisoners, around economic issues. We basically had to, learn how to read behind the media text that tended to represent, grassroots demonstrations, etc., in a very negative light. And now I think we are in a situation where there are progressive or potentially progressive people who are media workers. And, this means that they should play a very important role in these, efforts to develop a new kind of radicalism. But at the same time, we have to, learn how to read the media in ways that will encourage activism as opposed to simply considering the media as an adversary. In a sense, we're all dependent on the information that we receive through the media. The question is, how do we interpret it and how do we employ it in a way that is going to further our goals for radical activism?
Do you see, Angela, even when people have this ability to read the media, do you see this inclination towards activism that's in any way similar to what you saw, in the previous decades?
Well, I guess I would say that inclinations toward activism don't necessarily repeat themselves in the same way.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's extremely important particularly for, those of us who have the experience of previous decades, to be open to new forms of activism. Because in a sense, in the late 60s, there was a real rupture with the old forms of activism. There was a challenge to them. And, I think perhaps we might be in just such a period today. There's a tendency, I think, to dismiss some of the really important organizing efforts that are going on. I mean, it may be true, as you pointed out, Joy, that these grassroots efforts don't always have a kind of, global or anti-capitalist approach. But there is important work that's being done. And the question, I think, is how to legitimize that work, how to legitimate it within our own circles, and how to see its radical potential and encourage its radical potential. So I don't think that there's the same kind of work going on. But I do think that in a lot of ways there is a much more sophisticated political consciousness. And that has to do with the fact that, young people today basically depart from the theoretical and practical strategies that were developed during an early era. I mean, that is their starting point. And I think it's important to encourage them to go further. For example, within the realm of culture, that was a question that, was raised before. Culture is an important site for the development of politics and political consciousness, particularly for young people. And, I think it's extremely important to encourage people who are active in cultural politics to spread the word about the nature of capitalism today, about the prison-industrial complex, about the assault on immigrants' rights, about the dismantling of the welfare system and the criminalization and demonization of black and Latina and Asian women, etc.
I have kind of a follow-up question on that issue of the forms of activism that we make use of today. as it relates to the media. People are saying that the media being so much more concentrated in a few hands presents unique challenges to ordinary people, to working people. And it strikes me that for example, in Marx's own time, that the media was certainly very concentrated in capitalist hands, and yet there was very serious organizing that took place, and there were very serious threats to that hegemonic power of capitalist interests. So I wonder if the issue is not so much the media and the fact of the media being concentrated, because perhaps that's just a given. We have to accept that what we need to return to are those older forms of personal organizing on the streets.
Well, I think it's a mix. I think definitely we need to return to a sense of connection with each other, and if that's the older forms of organizing, that you actually meet with people in union halls or in churches or in homes, and that there's something about that human connection to talk about ideas and information. And at the same time, we have the internet, we have alternative radio, we have cable access TV, we have free speech TV. So that technology can be used as well. But even when we talk about the vehicles and the strategy for activism, I'm listening to my students talk in class, sometimes wonder about their abilities to have a very strong critique, but that doesn't always lead to concrete forms of activism. Do you understand what I'm saying?
Oh, yeah.
For instance, Angela, remember The Nation of Law? This is a part 2 of the Eyes on the Prize series.
Right.
And you're in it and you're talking about prisons, and this is just before the Attica, and it has the shots, the documentary of the Attica rebellion and then the repression, which I think almost 50 people died. And after the video, the first part was on COINTELPRO and the assassination of Hampton and Clark in Chicago in 1971. After the video, the students had this very clear critique of the state and of repression and in structural racism, right? But it was almost a sophisticated cynicism on the part of some students that, they could express the critique, that they had an analysis of what went on in prison. Some people had uncles who had been in prison, right? But again, I'm repeating myself earlier, without a vision about something they could move forward to, it just became, well, this is these are the landmines as they're out there, and we just need to make sure that we skirt them and we don't become casualties ourselves.
Yeah, I think you're right. But I also think that it's more than a vision that may be lacking. It is, also a sense of the importance of organizing work. This is something, a lot of us have been trying to emphasize for a long time, because even in prior eras, the movement organizer has never been given the credit that she or he deserves. And in that sense, perhaps we may need to return to older forms in which, perhaps the trade union organizer plays an important and acknowledged role, or we need to develop a critique of the fact that the civil rights organizer may not have been given the credit that she deserves. Rather the focus at the time and in the representations of the civil rights movement in historical literature, in visual culture, tends to focus on the spokesperson or the leader at the exclusion of the organizer, to the exclusion of the organizer. So, I think we also need to find ways to elevate the position of the organizer, to encourage people to, actually try to develop those skills. Because my impression has been that oftentimes, as you were saying, Joy, in your class, the students felt they did have a critique, but didn't really know where to go with it.
Right.
And it's true that that there has to be a sense of where we're going from here, but at the same time, we have to know how we're going to get there. And if people, students and workers and community people, don't see the organizer as an extremely important figure, then people aren't going to want to learn those skills. So I think perhaps we need to find a way to encourage again the development of schools like Highlander, for example, where people actually learn how to do that work, and we have to figure out ways in which to make it exciting, because organizing work is usually the work that is never seen, and it's I always call it the housework of the movement, the invisible work.
That's why so many women do it.
That's why so many women do it. Yeah. But at the same time, it's that work without which nothing else happens.
Yeah. But see, that's an interesting one, right? Because it's a form of culture, a political culture that's not validated.
That's right.
Particularly when there's a push for professionalism and a push to get paid, right?
Absolutely.
And organizers are not well paid. And as you said, they're not well received. They're not even remembered often, particularly if they're women or working class or youth. And that would be really interesting to have a conscious strategy to use media, which is going back, Richard, to what you were talking about earlier, but to use media, to use different forms of technology to promote the organizer and to promote that kind of skilled as a bank, that people can acquire as a resource and as part of a larger political culture.
And especially within the trade union movement. I think that's one area that really has to be emphasized now that fewer workers are organized into trade unions than were unionized in the 30s at the time of the big organizing drive that led to the creation of the CIO. And at the same time, I think we need to perhaps situate union organizing somewhat differently than before, because it can't be seen separately from anti-racist, organizing, organizing around issues affecting women, such as reproductive rights, against, violence against women, and also it has to be organizing that has global connections. What are the trade unions doing now to support the workers in Korea, for example? What's happening now in response to the revelations regarding the way that Nike treats its workers in Vietnam?
Right.
These are issues that really ought to lead to massive organizing efforts in this country. And why isn't there a nationwide boycott of Nike shoes now? Everybody knows about it, right?
Lack of organization.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's so important. I think that's really the crux of the question here. And I don't know whether simply importing old organizing strategies into the present is going to accomplish that, particularly since the younger generations have, grown to maturity with a very different set of assumptions and have different sensibilities. And think about the issues in different ways. I don't know if it's possible to organize in the same way we learned how to organize. I would, of course, if it were possible, all we would have to do would be to impart those old skills to the new generations. But I don't think it happens that way. During the late 60s, when the movement that was called the Black Power movement, the Black Liberation movement emerged, new strategies were developed. Strategies that contested, both the traditional, trade union organizing strategies, as well as the organizing strategies of the civil rights movement. And I don't know where we go from here.
But it seems to me, at least, in relationship to Nike, that the new strategy would be one that could deal with the racialization of labor outside our borders and inside, that makes certain people's lives more expendable, but also the slick way in which Nike uses black figures, from, is it Michael Jordan to, is it Andrew Young now?
Yes.
So,
Wow.
And the way in which Nike makes special appeals to black communities.
To buy their products,
To buy
right?
the products, absolutely. So black people not only constitute the figures around which the commodification process happens, but the market as well.
Right.
And see, there are various ways in which we could do that. It could be done. Why doesn't a well-known hip-hop artist do a song about Nike?
Similar to the way that Sweet Honey and the Rock did "Are My Hands Clean," about women in Haiti making $2.40 a day to sew dresses for Kenwood that sells them to Sears, right?
Absolutely.
Well, that's actually the thing that I'm contesting, I think, because it strikes me that the younger generation has become jaded about the media, and that positive messages and critical messages in the media don't necessarily get incorporated into the way they think about the world, because they're used to treating the whole thing in a very hands-off way, because they know they can't really trust it. That's why I was suggesting that perhaps that interpersonal contact, that's the thing we need to return to, that in this age of high-tech media, those of us who would otherwise be doing the organizing have gotten away from that one-on-one approach, thinking that we can maximize our exposure.
But it's not an either or, is it, Richard?
Well, no, it probably isn't.
Okay, because I was thinking, this reminds me of where I live, Boulder, this, which is very good in a sense, this very communalism, but sometimes I feel, and I'm not saying that this is your position, but that search for community and that interpersonal relationship pushes you into almost enclaves of people. Do you know what I mean? And sort of a return to a previous era when it's called lifestyle simplification on some level when they're talking about consumerism, but I believe there can be political types of lifestyle simplification where you simply attempt to reject or put aside forms of technology that you feel you cannot control because conglomerates and corporations beat you there, and they seem to wield this incredible power. But the technology's open, and there are young people who creatively play with it and who do some subversive work with it.
Well, I think I'm suggesting something more deep than that, which is that the audience, the target audience, is jaded. So we're misdirected into thinking we can reach them in the mechanisms that the ruling class uses to begin with. We're just mistaken in thinking that.
Well, see, I would disagree with the characterization of a whole generation as jaded. Because in a sense, if we look at the period before the civil rights movement, it might have been argued that black people in the South, where I grew up, had simply accommodated themselves to a system of segregation.
Oh, I don't mean to suggest they're jaded about life in general. I'm suggesting they're jaded about the media, the mass media.
About media as a vehicle for progressive struggle.
Just as a vehicle for truth.
Well, yeah, sure.
Sure.
All of us are jaded.
Jaded.
Right,
That,
that's, see?
I think. I mean, I'd like to be jaded with respect to.
It's a healthy side.
Yeah. Well,
Work today, those of us who fancy ourselves progressives.
well, I think we need to talk about the media and what is possible within the confines of this media that is obviously not organized in order to allow for the transmission of progressive or radical messages, right? But at the same time, it's possible to slip through the cracks. And I think we've been trying to do that for a while. That's what you're doing.
Yeah, indeed.
Working, with this radio station, right? I think it is important to listen to young people and to learn from them, because in a sense, I think each generation feels that the generation that is coming up, the younger generation, is not capable of accomplishing what the older one has accomplished. And perhaps in a sense that's true, but at the same time, they should be encouraged to find their own path. I think intergenerational communication and activism is extremely important. And at the same time, I think it's important for younger generations to challenge older generations. What I would argue is that, particularly among those of the younger generation who consider themselves politicized, there's often a tendency to revere the older figures and to assume that they indeed are not capable of achieving the same kind of radicalism as, say, a Malcolm X
Or Angela Davis.
Well, yeah, and I always discourage that. I always discourage that and argue that that in a sense they have to stand up against the older generation. They have to break free of it. They can't. There has to be, of course, some kind of connection, and a little reverence is okay, but a little disrespect also is necessary in order for them to begin to conceptualize new paths of activism.
But see, that's a really interesting statement, because while you were talking, I was thinking, okay, then your role as an older woman, particularly as a professor, so we both are teaching, right?
Right.
How do you encourage younger people to kind of stand on their own, to know the history of struggle, right, and know the historical figures in the contemporary history in terms of people who've been organizing for decades and who continue to organize, but also knowing that, be able to trust themselves and their own creativity and their own courage. And
well, Joy, I think there are some historical precedents for this, and the work that you've done on Ella Baker, for example, is a perfect illustration. Because Ella Baker decided to go with the young people who were challenging the leadership of SCLC, right?
right.
She decided to go with the youngsters who wanted to create an autonomous organization, SNCC. Fannie Lou Hamer decided to work with the younger people, and I think it's really important not, for older people not to see young people as just the kids in the movement, but as to see them as the source of new strength and new energy and new direction, and to be willing to follow them if necessary. Because if you look at the way revolutionary struggles have evolved throughout history across around the globe, it's usually young people who make those breaks and come up with these exciting, new ways to engage in revolutionary struggle. Isn't that true?
No, right. I was remembering that, and also remembering how I got politicized when I was in New York. Often, from meeting Charlene Mitchell or Norma Spector or others, people who would trust you, to stand up, but who were also there to support you.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think what often happens is that with, of course, the exceptions that we've mentioned, is that when we get older, we assume that we have all of the answers. And we look at younger people who may be groping,
right,
as incompetent, as politically incompetent. And we're not willing to sort of bear with them as they search and as they grope for new ways. And I think this is the kind of period we might be in right now. I mean, I'm hoping that this is the kind of period that we're in. And that's why I think it's so important, not to simply dismiss the younger generation and, not to spread these notions of apathy and to, argue that all young people are interested in is to get to move into the system, professionalization, etc. I mean, they might be interested in that, but in a sense, how can they avoid being interested in that? Because those are the prevailing ideologies.
Right.
But at the same time, I think that there are younger people who are doing extremely important work. Joy, you had Elihu Rosenblatt out to
right. He spoke in my class. Mm-hmm.
And I'm a member of the board of the organization that he directs, the Prison Activist Resource Center, and I'm extremely impressed by the work that he's done
right.
in encouraging a radical attitude towards the prison system, and in gathering all of this information that can be used by those of us who are trying to encourage an abolitionist strategy with respect to the prison system.
And here in Boulder, there's the Rocky Mountain Peace Center, and the woman who who organizes the Prisoners' Rights Project she's young, in her 20s. Someone who came out of the university, right?
And very energetic.
And very energetic.
And look at the work that's happened around the campaign for Mumia
Abu-Jamal. And in affirmative action, you're right. I mean, there are a lot of instances, like if you're looking for them, they come up.
Right.
But if you're looking for something else, for a sense of apathy, and it seems to me then there's a call for distinct types of political maturity, not just political maturity from the young, but also political maturity from older people so that they actually know how to work with younger people.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Because there seems to, there's often a tendency when you have a group of older activists organizing a rally, for example,
Mm-hmm.
say, we need a youth representative.
Right.
Right. And then, perhaps a youth speaker is invited to participate in the rally, but that youth speaker is marginalized.
Mm-hmm.
Not, he or she is not really a part of the real deal. This is just the youth representative. And I think we have to get away from that attitude. Because I can remember as a young person myself how within, for example, the Communist Party, how those of us who were younger, were not afraid to go up against and challenge what we felt were sometimes outmoded strategies that were being embraced by older people, as much as we respected our elders and their histories and their extremely important contributions. And I think that this kind of relationship needs to be encouraged. That's another sense in which we might be able to learn some lessons from the past, Richard.
On the subject of vision, I did want to ask you while we were here about your decision to leave the Communist Party.
About my decision to leave the Communist Party?
Mm-hmm.
Well, it wasn't an individual decision. It wasn't a personal decision. It was a decision made within, the context of a campaign that a number of us were organizing within the party. Basically an effort to further democratize the party from within in the aftermath of the revelations regarding the Soviet Union and the other socialist countries. And those of us who left the party left when it became clear that it was no longer possible to do that work within. As a matter of fact, a number of us who had been in the leadership of the party were prevented from running for office because we had signed or circulated a petition. So that was the context, and many of the people who left at that time attempted to organize a new formation, the Committees of Correspondence, and I'm presently a member of the Committees of Correspondence.
And what are your thoughts about the roles of such organizations, the committees as well as the Communist Party?
Well, I think we need as many left, radical, progressive organizations doing the work as possible. Of course, this is a period, as we've been saying throughout this conversation, in which visible, dramatic organizing efforts have waned. And at this point, I think we need, everybody's contribution to find a way out of this, conservative era, this cascading conservatism.
Well, and to return to a little bit more pragmatic note, you've referred to the prison industrial complex, which I think describes a phenomenon that seems to me to be a relatively new development in American capitalism, the taking advantage of prison labor and the incarceration of whole sectors of the population. What can you tell us about the larger effort to confront that?
Well, first of all, I would say that we need to encourage the use of this concept. And I draw from the historical example of the military-industrial complex. And I remember the period of organizing against the war in Vietnam when this notion began to emerge, the military-industrial complex. And I remember how it was popularized and came to be used on a mass level by vast numbers of people. I think it's important to attempt to popularize the notion of the prison industrial complex in the same way. Now, the prison industrial complex reflects a whole series of very complex developments around the prison system, some of which you've mentioned, the incarceration of enormous sectors of communities of color, particularly black communities. About 1/3 of all young black men are presently in prison or directly under the control and surveillance of the criminal justice system. It should be also mentioned that women's prison space is increasing at a rate that is even greater than the increase of men's prison space. Women are being arrested and imprisoned at a much higher rate than men, although the absolute numbers, of course, of women remain very small. Now, there are also some other developments. The privatization of prison systems, which is very much linked to the increasing use of prison labor. The role of the construction industry in this whole process of expanding the prison system means that there are direct capitalist stakes in the expansion of the prisons. The prison construction sector of the construction industry is the most profitable at this point. And this prison construction sector is in the process of being transnationalized as well. There are other connections I think we need to draw. The connection between immigration and the expansion of the prison system. First of all, the criminalization and incarceration of immigrants, of undocumented immigrants. That's obvious. But one aspect that is perhaps not so obvious is that, the same processes that are leading to increased immigration into the U.S. that have to do with the colonization of third world economies and the creation of ever more difficult economic systems in those countries that lead people to use the same routes that the corporations used in migrating into those countries in order to come into the U.S. At the same time, when the corporations close shop in the U.S. and move into Vietnam or Indonesia or Korea or Mexico, conditions are created within the communities in the U.S. that used to be able to count on the jobs of those industries that lead to alternative economies such as drugs and sexual services that direct people in those communities toward the prison system.
Before we get to the issue of organizing efforts, because I did want to touch on that, I have to ask, I'm a little surprised to hear you pair Vietnam and Indonesia.
Well, I'm not pairing Vietnam and Indonesia, absolutely. We were talking about Nike a short while ago, and I guess you read about the revelations regarding the treatment of women workers in Ho Chi Minh City, where Nike has set up shop because it has found that labor is even cheaper there than in Indonesia.
Actually, I'm not familiar with that.
Right.
Well, perhaps I should, just say very briefly that there was a New York Times article, I think about a week ago, indicating that an investigation into a Nike factory in Vietnam revealed that the women workers were being treated horribly, not only in terms of the wages they were earning, but in terms of the repressive conditions in the factory. At one point, women were punished for wearing the wrong shoes to work. They were forced to run, I think literally for hours. Quite a number of the women were sent to the hospital, including some to the emergency. And as a result of the revelations regarding that treatment, Nike is attempting to counter them by selecting Andrew Young as their representative to negotiate, some sort of situation there.
It's some sort of standard around labor practices, but even when you were talking about Vietnam, China came to mind as well. This exploitation of workers that's tied to physical abuse. And as corporations migrate from the States, finding the cheapest labor, and they're not adverse, as in the case of Nike, as you point out, Angela, they're not adverse to having physical abuse be part of disciplining the labor force.
Absolutely.
No, I'm surprised because in general I had heard that the Vietnamese government was maintaining a very strong presence in those kinds of joint interest firms with Western companies in order to prevent that phenomena from occurring. So that's very disappointing to hear.
Yeah, it is, and I think it points to the power of these transnationals that supersedes oftentimes efforts on the part of particular governments to guarantee conditions of equality and viable working conditions. And I think we have to beware of that.
Well, on the subject of working conditions, perhaps we should return to that question of the organizing efforts to counter the prison industrial complex.
I think part of the organizing effort has to focus on the demonization of the prisoner. I mean, I'm going back to the issue of abuse here. The introduction of stun guns or stun belts, where you can have prisoners go out on a chain gang, and now they're not shackled together, and so that's an alleged improvement. But they have these belts that are electrified in some ways, and the prison guard, you can hire fewer guards, right? Because it's like having the remote for your TV. I mean, you simply point and push a button. And there hasn't been a massive outcry about that yet, as that technology, and it's torture technology, is introduced as a feature of our prisons for disciplining a workforce. And part of the reason I think there's so little outcry is that, one, the prisons have a racialized population, right? But to be an incarcerated person puts you in a special caste all by yourself, almost as a throwaway for too many of us in mainstream society.
Yeah, absolutely. The tendency to regard prisons now as simply a place for punishment is relatively new. Now the whole prospect of rehabilitation has been entirely given up within the so-called correctional community, and therefore, what small and puny efforts toward creating conditions within the prisons that may have acknowledged prisoners' humanity, these efforts are being entirely discarded. Excuse me, so that education is no longer a possibility in many prisons. The educational systems have been dismantled. Distance learning or education by correspondence has been dismantled. Even recreation is being eroded. And many prisons have now eliminated their weight rooms so that prisoners are no longer able to exercise and lift weights. I think that what is happening is that the burden of race is being shifted onto incarcerated populations, and therefore what we used to acknowledge quite clearly as the ideological consequences of racism are now no longer called racism, but they're acted out and they're acted upon within prisons. And no one cares how prisoners are treated, or people are not encouraged to care about prisoners who are demonized and treated as if they are not full human beings. And what I argue in this context is that this is a holdover from slavery. In a sense, prisons incorporate the vestiges of slavery, because after all, the 13th Amendment did not abolish slavery for people who will have been duly, quote, duly convicted of a crime. And I think it's extremely important for anti-racist movements to focus on the prison system because of the impact that it has not only on the prisoners themselves, but on the larger population. Because the prison is also serving as a model for development of schools for, quote, youth at risk, where the focus is on discipline and security rather than on learning. And I think we're going to see this model of the prison emerging in various venues throughout the society. They are the gated communities, of course, of the rich, but then there are also the fortress communities of the poor, the communities that are walled in. So I would, agree that organizing efforts need to, across the board, all progressive radical organizations need to place the prison industrial complex on their agenda in one way or another.
And also as groups, struggle with issues about community building and community formation. I mean, there has to develop not just the words or the rhetoric, but the actual activities that expand notions of community to include the incarcerated.
Absolutely. And also coalitions.
Mm-hmm.
We've been talking about coalitions for decades and decades. I think we have to think about imprisoned populations as a kind of community with which we need to develop coalitional relationships. Students and prisoners, workers and prisoners, community activists and prisoners, women's organizations and prisoners, etc.
And that's great because that goes beyond the social work model, right? That prisoners are a dependent population you would try to aid or, quote, rescue without recognizing the power and the intellectual and the analytical skills that prisoners have. I mean, I was thinking about the prison writings, from what we could call prison intellectuals, from Jackson to Mumia Abdul-Jamal,
Yes.
that there's this whole analysis of the state. There's analysis of repression, there's analysis of violence, there's analysis of racism, of sexual and gender relationships that those of us who are on the other side of the walls can really benefit from.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. We do have to give up this sort of missionary model of prison work. And unfortunately, so many of the people who are well-intentioned, who do work around prisons, approach prisoners as a missionary would approach the colonized, as sort of people to be saved, rather than acknowledging the agency of imprisoned people, and rather than acknowledging that in many important respects, in most important respects, prisoners are no different from people on the outside. It's just that they happen to be caught in one way or another.
That seems to have brought us back to this question of organizing. And Dr. Davis, in particular, I wonder, while we have a couple minutes left, your thoughts about what has kept various organizations from coming together in coalition in the past, and what we might do in the future in order to be more successful in those efforts.
Okay, I guess I would suggest that we need a variety of organizing strategies. Coalition building is one strategy. I don't think it is the only strategy. I think that it's important, particularly at this moment in our history, to think about organizations and movements that are politically based rather than identity-based. And I say this because the coalition model often assumes that there are these sort of fixed political places or cultural spaces where people belong more than they might belong to another organization or another space. And I think we have to challenge that. Labor organizing, communist organizing over the decades has attempted to, contest that, and has demonstrated that it is possible to organize around political projects and to establish political identity based on those political projects. And one of the things that I'm trying to do now, and Joy mentioned this earlier, is to help launch an Institute for Multiracial Justice that is trying to draw upon the experiences people have had over the years in doing multiracial organizing, particularly among communities of color. Then, of course, there is the coalitional model, which is the one that we tend to privilege during this period. So, what I'd like to talk about with respect to coalition building is unlikely coalitions. And, those unlikely coalitions would consist of, for example, groups like welfare rights organizers and organizers in various lesbian movements that attempt to challenge the way in which the state constructs family, because this ideological imposition of the nuclear family has a devastating impact, on the gay and lesbian community, just as it has and continues to have a devastating impact on single women, particularly women of color, who are receiving or have received welfare assistance.
Well, with that, perhaps we should let you go.
Well, thank you.
I promised to keep you just an hour, and I think we've gone a little over.
Okay. Yeah, I haven't been watching my clock, and you're right. We have gone over.
Okay. Take care, Angela.
Okay, Joy. I'll talk to you later.
All right.
Thank you very much.